"She's getting worse," my daughter-in-law whispered through the hallway wall, her voice cutting through my chest like a blade meant to kill quietly. I heard every single word, standing there with my hands still damp from washing their dishes. Dishes I'd been washing for 5 years without a single thank you. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, just please leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me keep telling these stories that need to be heard. My name is Eleanor Walsh, and at 73 years old, I thought I knew what love looked like. I thought family meant forever. I thought the sacrifices I made would be remembered with gratitude, not whispered about like symptoms of a disease. But I was wrong about everything. It was a Tuesday morning in Chicago when I heard those words that would change everything. The autumn light filtered through the kitchen window of what used to feel like home, casting long shadows across the marble countertops that I cleaned every single day. My arthritis-worn hands gripped the edge of the sink as Megan's voice drifted from the living room, where she was talking to someone on the phone. "Sometimes I think she doesn't even know what day it is anymore," she continued, her tone carrying that particular brand of false concern that people use when they want to sound caring while delivering poison. "The doctor says it's normal for her age, but it's getting harder to manage." "Doctor? What doctor?" I hadn't seen any doctor. My mind was as sharp as it had ever been. Sharper, perhaps, because pain has a way of clarifying things that comfort obscures. I stood there in my pale blue cardigan, the one my late husband Robert had bought me for our 40th anniversary, and felt something inside me crack like ice under pressure. Not my heart. That would have been too clean, too simple. This was something deeper, messier, like the sound of trust shattering into pieces too small to ever reassemble. The house around me felt foreign suddenly, despite the fact that I'd been living here for 5 years. 5 years since I'd sold my beloved home in Lincoln Park. The Victorian house with the garden where I'd grown prize-winning roses, where Robert and I had hosted Christmas dinners for 30 years, where every room held memories that felt more real than the present moment. I'd sold that house, my sanctuary, my independence, because my son Ethan had convinced me it was time. "The neighborhood's changing, Mom," he'd said, his voice filled with the kind of concern that sounds loving but feels like manipulation in retrospect. "And that big house is too much for you to handle alone. Come live with us. The kids need their grandmother close by." The kids. My grandchildren, Emma and Michael, aged 15 and 12, who barely looked up from their phones when I entered a room, who seemed to view me as part of the furniture. Useful sometimes, mostly just there, occasionally in the way. I'd believed Ethan when he'd painted that picture of multi-generational harmony. I'd imagined Sunday morning pancakes, homework help, bedtime stories, the kind of family life that greeting cards promised and memory often lied about. Instead, I'd found myself occupying the smallest bedroom in their Lake Forest mansion, the one they called the guest room, but which felt more like a closet with a window. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd used the proceeds from my home sale to help them buy this house. $200,000 of my life savings had gone toward their down payment. Money I'd saved penny by penny during 45 years of marriage to a man who worked double shifts at the steel mill, so we could build something lasting. "She put the milk in the pantry yesterday," Megan's voice continued from the other room, and I felt my face flush with anger. That was a lie. A complete fabrication. I'd never put milk in the pantry. I'd never done any of the things they claimed I'd done. Forgotten appointments that were never made, lost keys that were never given to me, repeated stories I'd never told. But I was beginning to understand the purpose of these lies. They were building a case, creating a narrative, constructing a version of reality in which I was no longer competent to make my own decisions, in which my increasing isolation and sadness could be reframed as cognitive decline rather than the natural response to being systematically erased from my own family. The kitchen where I stood had become my domain by default rather than invitation. I cooked meals that were consumed without comment, cleaned surfaces that were dirtied again within hours, maintained a household that never quite felt like it welcomed my presence. The refrigerator was covered with school calendars and social commitments that somehow never included me. Family photos lined the mantel in the living room, but none of them featured my face. I thought about the woman I used to be, before Robert's death, before the move, before I'd learned to make myself smaller and quieter in hopes of earning the love that should have been unconditional. I'd been Eleanor Walsh, head librarian at the Chicago Public Library for 30 years, a woman who'd organized fundraisers and book clubs and literacy programs. I'd been someone who mattered, whose opinions were sought, whose presence was valued. Now I was becoming someone who existed at the margins of other people's lives, tiptoeing around conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, excluded from decisions about holidays and vacations and futures that apparently didn't include me. The phone conversation in the living room was winding down, but I caught the final words that made my blood freeze. "I'll call you back after we talk to the lawyer about the next steps." Lawyer. Next steps. I pressed my back against the kitchen wall, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Through the archway, I could see Megan pacing back and forth, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors that I'd mopped just that morning. She was wearing one of those expensive athleisure outfits that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her blonde hair pulled back in a casual ponytail that probably required professional styling to achieve. At 42, Megan had the kind of carefully maintained appearance that money could buy. Regular facials, professional manicures, a personal trainer who came to the house twice a week. She'd never worked outside the home, at least not since marrying Ethan, but she carried herself with the authority of someone who'd earned her position through merit rather than marriage. The contrast between us was stark, and, I was beginning to suspect, intentional. While she glowed with health and affluence, I'd been fading. My clothes were practical rather than fashionable, chosen for comfort and durability rather than style. My gray hair was styled by a budget salon rather than the exclusive stylists Megan frequented. My hands showed the wear of decades of work, while hers remained soft and unmarked. I realized, standing there in that kitchen where I'd spent countless hours trying to make myself useful, that I'd been allowing myself to disappear. Bit by bit, day by day, I'd been erasing myself in hopes of becoming the kind of grandmother, the kind of mother-in-law, the kind of woman who would be welcomed rather than tolerated. But tolerance, I was learning, was not the same as love. And the whispered conversation I'd just overheard suggested that even tolerance had its limits. The sound of Megan's heels approached the kitchen, and I quickly turned back to the sink, picking up a dish towel with hands that trembled slightly. When she appeared in the doorway, her expression was neutral, carefully composed, the face of someone who'd just been discussing my mental deterioration, as if it were a fact rather than a fiction. "Eleanor," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced cheerfulness that people use with children and the elderly. "How are you feeling today?" The question felt like a trap. How was I feeling? I was feeling like a woman who'd just discovered that her own family was plotting against her. I was feeling like someone who'd sacrificed everything for people who viewed her as a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved. But I smiled, the same smile I'd been wearing for 5 years, and said, "I'm fine, dear. Just fine," because I wasn't ready to let them know that I'd heard everything. I wasn't ready to show them that the woman they thought was losing her mind was actually seeing everything with painful clarity. Not yet. The lies started small, like hairline cracks in a foundation that would eventually bring down the entire house. "Mom, you told me this story yesterday," Ethan would say when I shared a memory about his childhood, his voice carrying that patient tone reserved for the mentally declining. But I knew I hadn't told him anything. We barely spoke anymore beyond pleasantries about the weather and reminders about doctor appointments that were never for me. I began keeping a journal, hiding it in my dresser drawer like a teenager with secrets. Every conversation, every interaction, every moment of gaslighting carefully documented in my neat librarian's handwriting. If they wanted to convince the world I was losing my mind, I needed proof that I wasn't. The evidence was damning, but not in the way they intended. 5 years ago, when Ethan had first suggested I move in with them, the conversation had taken place in the sunroom of my Lincoln Park home. The afternoon light streamed through windows I'd washed myself just that morning, illuminating dust motes that danced like possibilities in the air. My roses were blooming outside, deep red climbers that Robert had planted for our 25th anniversary. "You shouldn't be living alone anymore, Mom," Ethan had said, his concern seeming genuine at the time. "What if something happens? What if you fall and there's no one to help you? I was 68 then, healthy and independent, more active than many people half my age. I'd been walking 3 miles every morning, volunteering at the literacy center, hosting book club meetings in my living room every Tuesday evening. My mind was sharp, my body strong, my life full of purpose and connection. But Ethan painted a different picture. The neighborhood's changing, he continued, gesturing toward the window where children played in the park across the street, their laughter carrying on the warm spring air. It's not safe like it used to be, and this house is so much work for one person. Megan had nodded sympathetically from her position on my antique settee, the one my mother had left me, her manicured fingers tracing the carved wooden armrest. We have so much space, she'd added, her voice soft with what I'd mistaken for genuine affection. The children would love having their grandmother so close. And honestly, Eleanor, we could use your help. Managing a household and the kids' schedules, it's overwhelming sometimes. They needed my help. The words had been music to my ears, a promise of purpose in a life that had felt increasingly empty since Robert's death 2 years earlier. I'd spent 45 years being needed, being essential to someone's daily existence. The prospect of becoming essential again, of having my experience and wisdom valued, had been intoxicating. Looking back now, I could see how carefully they'd orchestrated that conversation, how they'd emphasized my isolation while offering community, highlighted imaginary dangers while promising security, made me feel like I was choosing connection when I was actually choosing dependence. The house sale had happened quickly, too quickly for me to fully process what I was giving up. Real estate agents paraded through my home with their clipboards and measuring tapes, reducing 45 years of memories to square footage and market value. Strangers walked through my kitchen where I'd made countless family dinners, through the bedroom where Robert and I had shared our dreams and fears, through the garden where I'd planted hope every spring and harvested peace every autumn. "You're getting such a good price," the agent had said, as if money could compensate for the severing of roots that had grown deep into Chicago soil. "Older homes in this neighborhood are very desirable right now." The check had been substantial, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. $200,000 after fees and taxes, a nest egg that should have secured my independence for the rest of my life. Instead, it had become the foundation of my captivity. "Mom, we want you to feel like this is your investment too," Ethan had said when I'd offered to help with their down payment. "This will be your home as much as ours. Your name should be on something." But my name wasn't on the deed. It wasn't on the mortgage. It wasn't on anything except the bank transfer that had moved my life savings into their account, money that had disappeared into their larger financial ecosystem like a drop of water into an ocean. The guest room they'd prepared for me was smaller than my previous walk-in closet. Pale yellow walls, a single window facing the neighbor's fence, furniture that looked like it had been purchased from a hotel liquidation sale. The bed was a double, which felt spacious until I realized it was the first time in 45 years I'd slept in a bed not designed for 2 people. "We thought you'd prefer something cozy," Megan had said, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching me unpack my reduced belongings into inadequate storage space. "Less overwhelming than a big room. Cozy. That's what they called confinement now. My books, a lifetime collection of first editions and beloved paperbacks, had been donated to charity because there wasn't space for them. My china set, the one Robert and I had received as a wedding gift and used for every holiday dinner, had been stored in the basement, where the humidity would inevitably destroy it. My photo albums, decades of documented memories, had been relegated to a single shelf in the hallway closet, easily ignored and gradually forgotten, but the most devastating loss had been subtle, almost invisible. It was the erosion of my voice, my opinions, my right to participate in decisions that affected my daily life. In my own home, I'd been the one who decided what we ate for dinner, when we cleaned, how we organized our space. Here, I was expected to adapt to rhythms and routines that had been established without my input. "We eat dinner at 7, Megan had explained during my first week, as if I were a new employee receiving orientation. "The children have activities most evenings, so we try to keep things simple. I usually plan the meals on Sunday and do the grocery shopping on Monday." I'd offered to help with the cooking, drawing on decades of experience feeding a family, hosting dinner parties, creating meals that brought people together around the table. But my suggestions were met with polite dismissal. "That's so sweet of you to offer," Megan would say, "but I have everything under control. Maybe you could help by keeping an eye on the children while I cook." Babysitting. That's what my decades of culinary skill had been reduced to. Sitting in the living room with Emma and Michael while they ignored me in favor of their devices, occasionally making sure they didn't burn the house down while the real adult handled the important work. The grandchildren I'd moved across the city to be near remained distant, polite but unengaged. Emma, now 15, treated me with the casual dismissiveness that teenagers reserved for irrelevant adults. She'd answer direct questions with minimal responses, never volunteer information about her life, never seek my advice or opinion about anything that mattered to her. Michael, 12, was slightly warmer but still seemed to view me as a temporary presence rather than a permanent part of his life. He'd show me his video games occasionally, explain the rules with the patience adults use for children, but never invite me to play or share in his excitement. I'd imagined reading bedtime stories, helping with homework, passing on family traditions and wisdom accumulated over 7 decades of living. Instead, I found myself peripheral to their daily lives, useful for mundane tasks, but excluded from meaningful moments. The household routines became my prison. I woke early, earlier than necessary, because lying in that small bed in that small room made me feel like I was suffocating. I'd make coffee for everyone, though no one thanked me for the service. I'd tidy common areas that would be disrupted again within hours. I'd fold laundry that wasn't mine, wash dishes I hadn't dirtied, maintain a home where I was resident but not citizen. My days became a series of small services performed for people who accepted them as entitlements rather than gifts. Drive Emma to ballet class when Megan's yoga appointment ran late. Pick up Michael from soccer practice when traffic made Ethan's commute longer than expected. Wait for repair technicians, accept deliveries, manage the mundane logistics that keep households functioning. I was useful, but I wasn't valued. I was helpful, but I wasn't appreciated. I was present, but I wasn't seen. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to disappear. The woman who had once commanded respect in professional settings, who had organized community events and managed complex projects, who had opinions worth hearing and ideas worth considering, gradually faded into background noise. My suggestions were ignored, my observations dismissed, my attempts at conversation redirected toward safer, less consequential topics. "How was your day?" became a question no one asked me, while my inquiries about their days were answered with distracted half-attention and minimal detail. I learned more about their lives from overheard phone conversations than from direct communication. The isolation was profound and deliberate. When they entertained friends, I was expected to make myself scarce. When they planned family activities, my inclusion was an afterthought if it occurred to them at all. When they discussed future plans, vacations, home improvements, changes to their routines, my input wasn't sought. I was living in their house, but I wasn't part of their family. I was existing in their space, but I wasn't occupying their thoughts. I was present in their daily lives, but I was absent from their emotional landscape. And now, standing in this kitchen where I performed services without recognition, listening to whispered conversations about my supposed mental decline, I realized that my disappearance hadn't been accidental. It had been intentional. They hadn't invited me into their lives to enrich their family dynamics or benefit from my experience and wisdom. They had moved me in to manage me, to control me, to slowly and systematically remove my autonomy while maintaining the appearance of loving care. The question that had been haunting me for months finally crystallized into words I could no longer avoid. Was I being used? The answer, whispered through hallway walls by people who thought I couldn't hear, was becoming impossible to ignore. The birthday that broke me wasn't mine. It was Emma's 16th, and I wasn't invited to my own granddaughter's party. I discovered this by accident, the way you discover most betrayals. I was folding laundry in the basement when I heard Megan on the phone upstairs, her voice drifting through the heating vents like poison in the air. "No, just family and her close friends," Megan was saying, her tone casual, as if she were discussing the weather. We want to keep it intimate. You know how overwhelming big gatherings can be for some people. Some people. She meant me. I stood there in that basement, surrounded by their clothes that I washed and folded every week, holding one of Emma's sweaters against my chest, like armor that wouldn't protect me from anything. The fabric smelled like the expensive perfume Megan bought for her, the kind that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Emma's party was planned for the following Saturday. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, had even bought her a first edition copy of Jane Eyre from a used bookstore downtown, spending money I couldn't really afford because I remembered how much she'd enjoyed reading it for English class. I'd wrapped it carefully in paper I'd saved from Christmas, written a card about how proud I was of the young woman she was becoming, but I wouldn't be there to give it to her. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my knees weak. I sank onto the basement steps, still clutching Emma's sweater, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. It wasn't just hurt. It was recognition, the understanding that I had been systematically excluded from my own family's life, that my presence was not just unwanted, but actively avoided. Later that evening, I approached Emma directly, hoping there had been some misunderstanding. "Honey, what time should I be ready for your party on Saturday?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light and grandmother-like, the way it used to sound when she was little and would run to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings. Emma looked up from her phone with the kind of startled expression people get when they're asked about something they've forgotten exists. For a moment, I saw confusion flicker across her features, followed by something that looked like guilt. "Oh, Grandma Eleanor," she said, her voice taking on that careful tone I'd heard her use with her mother when she was in trouble. "It's just going to be really small. Like, super low-key. You probably wouldn't enjoy it anyway. It's mostly going to be loud music and teenager stuff." The dismissal was gentle, but absolute. At 15, my granddaughter had learned to exclude me with the same practiced ease as her parents, wrapping rejection in concern for my comfort. I was too old, too fragile, too different to be included in the celebration of her transition into adulthood. I smiled and nodded, the way I'd trained myself to do when faced with these small cruelties. "Of course, dear. You have fun with your friends." But that night, lying in my narrow bed in my narrow room, I stared at the ceiling and wondered when I had become someone to be protected from joy rather than included in it. When had my presence become a burden rather than a blessing? The pattern was everywhere once I started looking for it. The family photos that decorated every surface of the house told the story with brutal clarity. Hundreds of pictures of Ethan, Megan, Emma, and Michael at restaurants I'd never been to, on vacations I'd never been invited to join, at events I'd learned about only after they'd happened. There was the photo from their trip to Colorado last Christmas, all four of them grinning on a ski slope while I'd spent the holiday alone in the house, telling myself they deserved time together as a nuclear family. The pictures from Emma's school award ceremony, where she'd received recognition for academic achievement that I'd helped her earn through hours of homework assistance that apparently didn't warrant my presence at the celebration. Michael's championship soccer game, where he'd scored the winning goal. I'd driven him to practices for 2 years, sat through games in the rain and cold, cheered from the sidelines until my voice was hoarse. But when the moment of triumph came, when he lifted that trophy and smiled for the camera, I wasn't there. I was at home, preparing a dinner they'd eat without talking to me about the victory they'd won. Each photograph was a small exclusion, a moment of family joy that I'd been deemed unworthy to share. Together, they formed a mosaic of deliberate isolation, evidence that my absence from their lives wasn't accidental but intentional. The medical appointments began shortly after Emma's birthday, presented as loving concern for my well-being. Dr. Peterson, a geriatrician I'd never chosen, who'd been selected for me without my input or consent. "We just want to make sure you're taking care of yourself," Megan had said when she announced the appointment, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that makes your teeth ache. "At your age, it's important to stay on top of these things." My age. As if 73 was some kind of expiration date, a number that automatically invalidated my right to make decisions about my own health care. I'd been managing my own medical care for decades, maintaining relationships with doctors who knew my history, who treated me with respect and dignity. But Dr. Peterson was different. He spoke to Megan instead of to me, addressing her as if she were my legal guardian rather than my daughter-in-law. When I tried to ask questions about the tests he was ordering, he'd pat my hand condescendingly and say, "Don't worry about the technical details. Your family will help you understand everything you need to know." The tests were extensive and expensive. Cognitive assessments, blood work, brain scans that required me to lie still in claustrophobic machines while technicians looked for evidence of decline that I knew they wouldn't find. Because I wasn't declining, I was sharper than I'd been in years, hyper-aware of every slight, every manipulation, every careful word chosen to undermine my autonomy. But the test results were interpreted through the lens of predetermined conclusions. Normal variations in memory and processing speed became areas of concern. The slight tremor in my hands that came from arthritis, not neurological dysfunction, was noted as possible early motor symptoms. My perfectly reasonable frustration with being patronized and dismissed was documented as increased agitation and difficulty with emotional regulation. "We're just trying to help you," Dr. Zhao Peterson said during one appointment, his voice carrying the practiced patience of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult elderly patients. "These changes are normal for someone your age, but they can make daily life more challenging. It's good that you have family who care enough to stay involved in your healthcare decisions." Healthcare decisions that I wasn't being allowed to make. Medications that appeared in my bathroom cabinet without my knowledge or consent. Appointments scheduled without consulting my preferences or availability. Medical information shared with Megan and Ethan while being withheld from me, as if my own health were too complex for me to understand. The social worker visit was the final straw, though I didn't understand its significance at the time. She appeared at the door on a Tuesday morning, a pleasant woman in her 40s with a briefcase full of assessment forms and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm just here to check on how everyone's doing," she said, settling into the living room with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to evaluating family dynamics. Sometimes when multiple generations live together, it can be helpful to have an outside perspective on how things are working. But she wasn't there to assess how things were working for me. Her questions were directed at Megan and Ethan, inquiries about my behavior, my ability to manage daily tasks, my interactions with the grandchildren. I was present but peripheral, like a subject being discussed, rather than a person with agency and opinion. "She's been having some difficulties," Megan explained, her voice heavy with regret that sounded practiced. "Forgetting conversations, repeating herself, sometimes seeming confused about where she put things. We love her dearly, but it's becoming challenging to know how best to help her. Forgetting conversations that had never happened, repeating stories I'd never told, losing items that had been moved by other people. Each accusation was gentle, wrapped in concern, impossible to refute without sounding exactly like the defensive, confused elderly person they were painting me to be." The social worker took notes, nodding sympathetically, occasionally glancing at me with the kind of professional compassion reserved for people who needed to be managed rather than heard. When she asked if I had any concerns about my living situation, Megan answered before I could speak. "She's been expressing some anxiety about being a burden," Megan said, her hand reaching over to pat mine in a gesture that felt more like a warning than comfort. "We keep telling her she's family, that we want her here, but sometimes she seems to forget that we've had these conversations." I hadn't expressed anxiety about being a burden. I had become one, whether I'd expressed it or not. But my silence in that room, my failure to contradict their narrative, was interpreted as confirmation of their assessment. The confused elderly woman who couldn't even advocate for herself effectively. That night, I sat in my small room and looked at myself in the mirror above the dresser. The woman looking back at me seemed smaller than I remembered, grayer, more fragile, but her eyes were clear, and her mind was sharp, and she was beginning to understand that she was fighting for more than just respect or inclusion. She was fighting for her right to exist as a person rather than a problem to be solved. I opened my journal and began to write, documenting every conversation, every appointment, every small cruelty that had brought me to this moment. If they wanted to build a case that I was incompetent, I would build my own case that I was not. But first, I needed to understand exactly what they were planning, and that meant listening more carefully to the conversations they thought I couldn't hear, the phone calls they made when they assumed I was safely out of earshot. Because the whispers I'd been hearing weren't just gossip or casual concern, they were strategy sessions, planning meetings for a future that didn't include my consent, and I was running out of time to stop them. The phone call that shattered my world came at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning in October. I know the exact time because I was awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the chest pain I'd been experiencing was anxiety or something more serious. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before someone picked up downstairs. Ethan's voice, muffled but audible through the thin walls of this house that had never felt like home. "Yes, I understand the urgency," he was saying, his tone crisp and businesslike despite the hour. "We've been documenting everything. The confusion, the forgetfulness, the increasing agitation. My wife has been keeping detailed records." I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor, and crept to the top of the stairs. The conversation was clearer from there, each word landing like a physical blow. "The social worker's assessment supports our concerns," Ethan continued. "Dr. Peterson has already indicated he'd be willing to testify that she's no longer capable of managing her own affairs. We're looking at full guardianship." Guardianship. The word hung in the dark air like smoke, acrid and choking. They weren't just planning to manage me. They were planning to own me, to strip away every legal right I had to make decisions about my own life. "The house proceeds are still in the joint account," Ethan's voice continued, and I could hear papers rustling, as if he were consulting documents. 200,000, plus the quarterly investment returns. If we move quickly, before she realizes what's happening, we can establish the conservatorship and transfer everything to a trust for her care. My money. The proceeds from the home Robert and I had built together, the savings we'd accumulated through decades of careful planning and sacrifice. They were discussing it like it was theirs, like my life's work was simply another asset to be managed. "Megan's been brilliant with the documentation," Ethan said, and I could hear the smile in his voice, the satisfaction of a plan well executed. Every forgotten conversation, every moment of confusion, every sign of decline. "The lawyer says we have more than enough evidence. Evidence. Fabricated evidence. Lies carefully constructed to paint me as incompetent, while they systematically isolated me from anyone who might contradict their narrative." I gripped the banister so tightly my knuckles went white, fighting the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm me. This wasn't happening because they loved me and wanted to protect me. This was happening because they wanted my money, and I was inconveniently still alive and legally entitled to it. The conversation continued for 20 more minutes, but I'd heard enough. I crept back to my room on legs that felt like water, closed the door silently, and sat on the edge of my bed in the darkness, trying to process the magnitude of their betrayal. They had been planning this for months, maybe years. Every medical appointment, every social worker visit, every concerned conversation about my well-being had been choreographed to build a legal case for my incompetence. They had turned my grief, my isolation, my reasonable responses to their cruelty into symptoms of mental decline, and I had played right into their hands, accepting their version of reality, allowing myself to be diminished and dismissed until I almost believed their lies myself. Almost. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, watching Megan prepare breakfast with the casual efficiency of someone whose conscience was clear. She hummed while she worked, occasionally smiling at me with what I now recognized as the kind of condescending affection people reserve for pets or small children. "How did you sleep, Eleanor?" she asked, her voice bright with false cheer. "You look a little tired. Maybe you should rest more today." Rest. Another way of saying, stay out of the way while we finalize our plans for your future. "I slept fine," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "Actually, I've been thinking about taking a little trip. Maybe visiting my friend Margaret in Springfield." The change in Megan's expression was subtle, but unmistakable. The practiced smile faltered for just a moment, replaced by something sharper, more calculating. "Oh, I don't think that's a good idea right now," she said, her tone still sweet but with an edge of steel underneath. "You know how confused you get in unfamiliar places. And Margaret is so busy with her own health issues. I'd hate for you to be a burden. Margaret Chen, my former colleague at the library, was 75 and ran marathons. She'd been sending me letters for months, inviting me to visit, expressing concern about my isolation. Letters that I now realized Megan had probably been screening, just as she'd been monitoring my phone calls and internet usage. I spoke with Dr. Peterson yesterday, Megan continued, returning to her breakfast preparations with renewed focus. He mentioned that travel can be particularly disorienting for people in your situation. He suggested we stick to familiar routines for now. My situation. Another euphemism for the fiction they'd created about my mental state. That afternoon, while Megan was at her Pilates class and the children were at school, I made the phone call I should have made months ago. Margaret answered on the second ring, her voice warm with genuine pleasure at hearing from me. "Eleanor, I was just thinking about you. How are you, dear?" The question broke something loose inside me, and for the first time in months, I told the truth. I told her about the isolation, the exclusion, the medical appointments I hadn't requested, the social worker visit that felt like an interrogation. I told her about the whispered conversations and the plans for guardianship, and the way they discussed my money as if it were already theirs. Margaret listened without interruption, her silence heavy with understanding rather than judgment. "Oh, honey," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been so worried about you. Your letters stopped coming, and when I called, Megan always said you were resting or couldn't come to the phone. I was beginning to think that I was losing my mind," I finished for her. "That they were isolating you deliberately," she said, her words carrying the weight of recognition. "Eleanor, I need you to listen to me very carefully. What you're describing isn't care, it's abuse. Financial abuse, emotional abuse, and possibly criminal fraud." Criminal fraud. The words hit me like cold water, shocking but clarifying. What felt like family dysfunction was actually something much more serious, something with legal consequences and criminal penalties. "Margaret, I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I feel like I'm going crazy, but I know I'm not. I feel like I'm trapped, but I don't know how to get out." "You're not trapped," Margaret said firmly. "You're 73 years old, not 7. You have rights, you have resources, and you have people who care about you. But you need to act quickly before they can file for guardianship." She gave me the name of an attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had successfully defended dozens of seniors against financial exploitation by family members. "Call her today," Margaret insisted. "Don't wait. Don't hesitate. Don't let them convince you that this is normal or that you're overreacting. Trust your instincts, Eleanor. They've been right all along." The phone call to Sarah Mitchell was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Her voice was crisp, professional, but warm with genuine concern as I explained my situation. "Mrs. Walsh, what you're describing follows a very familiar pattern," she said when I'd finished. "Adult children who view their elderly parents as assets rather than people, who systematically isolate them from outside support while building a case for incompetence. The good news is that if you're mentally competent, and you clearly are, we can stop this." "What do I need to do?" I asked, my voice steady for the first time in months. "First, we need to document everything. I want you to write down every conversation, every incident, every medical appointment. Second, we need to get you an independent medical evaluation from a doctor they haven't chosen. Third, we need to protect your assets before they can claim guardianship and transfer your money." She explained that I could revoke the power of attorney I'd signed when I moved in with them, the document that had seemed like a simple convenience at the time, but had actually given them broad authority over my financial affairs. "Can you get to a bank tomorrow?" she asked. Without them knowing, I thought about my daily routine, the careful surveillance that had become normal, the way Megan always found reasons to accompany me on errands. "I think so," I said. "I usually walk to the corner store for groceries. There's a bank branch nearby." "Good. I'll call ahead and arrange for a private banker to meet with you. Bring identification and any financial documents you have access to. We're going to freeze the joint accounts and establish new ones in your name only." That evening at dinner, I watched my family with new eyes. Ethan carved the roast I'd prepared, discussing his day at the office with the casual confidence of someone whose life was proceeding according to plan. Megan supervised the children's homework with the patient authority of someone secure in her domestic role. Emma and Michael chatted about school activities and weekend plans with the easy assumption that their futures were stable and certain. None of them looked at me except to make polite conversation about my day or remind me to take medications I didn't need. None of them seemed to notice that I was studying them, memorizing their expressions, understanding finally that the people I'd loved and sacrificed for had never seen me as family. I was inventory. I was an asset to be managed, a problem to be solved, a source of funding for their lifestyle, the grandmother who'd given up her independence to help raise their children, the mother who'd contributed her life savings to their down payment, the woman who'd spent 5 years cooking and cleaning and caring for their household had been reduced to a line item in their financial planning. But I wasn't going to make it easy for them anymore. "I've been thinking about taking a little trip," I said casually, cutting my meat with hands that no longer trembled. "Maybe visiting Margaret for a few days." The silence that followed was profound. Ethan's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Megan's eyes sharpened with alarm. Even the children looked up from their plates, sensing tension they couldn't understand. "Mom, we've talked about this," Ethan said carefully. "Travel is really not advisable right now. Dr. Peterson was very clear about the risks." "Dr. Peterson isn't my guardian," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "I'm still legally competent to make my own decisions about where I go and what I do." The word legally hung in the air like a challenge, and I saw understanding flicker across their faces. They knew that I knew. The pretense was over. "Of course you are," Megan said quickly, her voice bright with false reassurance. "We're just concerned about your safety. You know how much we love you." Love. The word felt obscene coming from her lips, a mockery of everything I'd believed about family loyalty and care. But I smiled, the same gentle smile I'd been wearing for 5 years, and said, "I know exactly how much you love me." And for the first time since I'd moved into their house, I saw fear in their eyes. The morning I walked into First National Bank, I felt like a woman emerging from a cave after years of darkness, blinking in sunlight that seemed almost too bright to bear. My hands shook as I approached the customer service desk, not from confusion or decline, but from the terrifying exhilaration of taking control of my own life for the first time in 5 years. The young teller looked up with the practiced smile of professional courtesy, but something in my expression must have conveyed urgency because her demeanor immediately shifted to genuine concern. "I need to speak with someone about my accounts," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah Mitchell's office called ahead. "I'm Eleanor Walsh." Within minutes, I was seated across from Janet Morrison, a private banker in her 50s, who looked at me with the kind of respectful attention I'd almost forgotten existed. She didn't speak to me like I was elderly or confused or incapable of understanding complex financial matters. She treated me like what I was, a woman with substantial assets who had every right to control them. "Mrs. Walsh, I've reviewed your accounts," Janet said, spreading documents across her desk with professional efficiency. "I have to say, what I'm seeing here is deeply concerning." The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. The joint account that had contained my $200,000 house proceeds 5 years ago now held less than $30,000. Regular transfers had been moving money to accounts I'd never authorized, investments I'd never approved, expenditures I'd never been consulted about. "This transfer here?" Janet pointed to a line item from 3 months ago. $15,000 to something called Walsh Family Trust. "Are you familiar with this trust?" I wasn't. I'd never heard of it, never signed documents creating it, never been informed of its existence. But seeing it there on the bank statement, I understood its purpose immediately. They were moving my money into legal structures that would make it harder for me to reclaim if I ever challenged their control. "And these monthly transfers," Janet continued, her finger tracing a pattern of $2,000 withdrawals, "they're going to what appears to be a management company. Do you recall authorizing ongoing fees for asset management?" I shook my head, feeling nauseated as the scope of their theft became clear. For 5 years, while I'd been cooking their meals and washing their clothes and babysitting their children, They'd been systematically looting my life savings. Mrs. Walsh, I need to ask you directly. Janet's voice was gentle but firm. Are you making these financial decisions yourself, or is someone else managing your money without your full knowledge and consent? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized this was the moment of truth. I could continue the charade, pretend that I was simply confused about financial matters I was too elderly to understand, or I could speak the truth that had been building inside me like pressure in a kettle. Someone else has been managing my money, I said, the words coming out stronger than I'd expected. And I want it stopped immediately. Janet nodded as if she'd been expecting this answer. I'm going to freeze all joint accounts and cancel any automatic transfers, she said, already pulling forms from her desk drawer. We'll need to establish new accounts in your name only, with new access codes and security protocols. The paperwork took 2 hours, but it felt like the most productive time I'd spent in years. Each signature was an act of rebellion, each form a declaration of independence from the family that had reduced me to a financial resource to be exploited. Mrs. Walsh, Janet said as we concluded our business, I want you to know that what's been happening to you is unfortunately not uncommon, but it's also not legal. If you're interested in pursuing this further, I can recommend someone who specializes in financial elder abuse cases. I already have an attorney, I said, and the words felt powerful in my mouth. Thank you for treating me like I have a brain in my head. Janet smiled, the first genuine expression of respect I'd received from a professional in months. You clearly do. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Walking home from the bank, I felt lighter than I had in years, as if I'd physically removed weights that had been pressing down on my shoulders. The October air was crisp, the leaves were turning brilliant colors, and for the first time in so long, I noticed the beauty around me instead of just surviving each day. But I also knew that my actions would have consequences. By the time I reached the house, Megan's car was already in the driveway, though it was only 2 p.m. and she usually didn't return from her various appointments until evening. My phone had been buzzing with missed calls and text messages that I'd been ignoring, but now I realized why they'd been trying to reach me so desperately. The bank must have called them about the frozen accounts. I walked through the front door to find Megan pacing the living room like a caged animal, her phone pressed to her ear. When she saw me, her expression shifted from anxious to furious in the space of a heartbeat. She's here, Megan said into the phone, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. I'll call you back. She hung up and turned to face me, her usual mask of concerned affection completely abandoned. For the first time in 5 years, I was seeing the real Megan, the woman who'd been hiding behind false smiles and manufactured worry. What did you do? She demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I took control of my own finances, I replied calmly, hanging my coat in the closet with deliberate normalcy. Something I should have done years ago. You can't just freeze the accounts, Eleanor. There are automatic payments, standing orders, financial obligations that depend on those funds. Whose financial obligations? I asked, turning to face her. Because as far as I know, those are my funds, not yours. Megan's face flushed red, and for a moment I thought she might actually strike me. Instead, she pulled out her phone again, her fingers flying over the screen as she typed what was undoubtedly a frantic message to Ethan. You're not thinking clearly, she said, her voice switching to the patronizing tone she used when she wanted to make me feel incompetent. This is exactly the kind of confused decision-making Dr. Peterson warned us about. You're going to hurt yourself, and you're going to hurt this family. I'm protecting myself, I corrected. From this family. The words hung in the air between us, finally giving voice to the truth we'd both been dancing around for months. Megan's expression shifted again, this time to something that looked almost like grudging respect. You don't understand what you're doing, she said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. We've been taking care of everything for you, managing your money, handling your affairs, making sure you're provided for. Without us, you'd be completely lost. Without you, I'd still have my independence, I replied, and my savings account. Ethan arrived home within the hour, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from what had clearly been a rush trip from the office. He burst through the front door like a man responding to an emergency, his briefcase clutched in one hand and his phone in the other. "Mom, what's going on?" he said, his voice carrying the kind of forced calm that people use in crisis situations. "The bank called me about some kind of irregularity with your accounts." "There's no irregularity," I said, settling into the living room chair that had become my usual spot for family confrontations. "I simply took control of my own money." Ethan sat down across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees in the posture he used when he wanted to appear earnest and concerned. It was the same position he'd adopted when he'd convinced me to sell my house, when he'd suggested I move in with them, when he'd persuaded me to sign the power of attorney that had given them access to my financial life. "Mom, I understand you want to feel independent," he said, his voice gentle but with an undertone of desperation. "But you have to understand that managing finances is complicated. There are tax implications, investment strategies, legal requirements that can be overwhelming for someone who isn't familiar with modern financial systems. Someone like me," he meant. Someone old, someone confused, someone who couldn't be trusted to make rational decisions about her own money. "I managed my finances just fine for 70 years, I replied. "I think I can handle them for however many years I have left." "But you made mistakes," Megan interjected from her position by the window, where she'd been staring out at the street as if expecting reinforcements to arrive. "You forgot about bills, mixed up dates, had trouble understanding the statements." More lies. More fabricated evidence of incompetence that they'd been carefully constructing for months. "Show me," I said simply. "What?" Ethan looked confused. "Show me these mistakes I made. Show me the bills I forgot, the dates I mixed up, the statements I couldn't understand. I'd like to see the evidence." The silence that followed was profound. Ethan and Megan exchanged glances that communicated volumes about the fabricated nature of their concerns. They had no evidence because there had been no mistakes, no confusion, no cognitive decline beyond what they'd invented to justify their financial abuse. That evening, after a dinner eaten in tense silence, I made my second phone call to Margaret. This time, I wasn't calling for emotional support or validation. I was calling to make plans. "I want to come visit," I said without preamble when she answered. "Tomorrow, if possible." "Of course," Margaret said immediately. "For how long?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Maybe permanently." I could hear the smile in her voice when she replied. "Eleanor Walsh, I have been waiting 5 years to hear you say those words. Come home, dear friend. Come home." That night, I packed a single suitcase with the same methodical care I'd used when I'd left my beloved house 5 years ago. But this time, I wasn't packing with the hope of being welcomed into a loving family. I was packing with the knowledge that I was finally reclaiming the life that had been stolen from me. I folded my clothes, selected my most treasured photographs, gathered the few possessions that truly belonged to me rather than the household I'd been serving. As I worked, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, anticipation for the future rather than resignation to an unbearable present. I was 73 years old, and I was running away from home. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it didn't feel shameful. It felt like the first sensible decision I'd made in 5 years. In the morning, I would leave this house that had never been my home, these people who had never seen me as family, this life that had been slowly crushing me under the weight of their expectations and manipulations. I would go back to Springfield, to my friend who valued my mind and cherished my company, to a place where I could remember who I used to be before I'd allowed myself to be diminished and dismissed. For the first time in years, I fell asleep looking forward to tomorrow. I never expected them to call the police. At 6 a.m., as I was loading my single suitcase into the taxi I'd called to take me to the train station, 2 Chicago police officers approached the driveway with the cautious steps of people responding to a domestic disturbance call. "Ma'am, we received a call about a vulnerable adult who might be in distress," the older officer said, his voice professional but kind. "Are you Eleanor Walsh?" Behind me, I could see Ethan and Megan standing in the doorway of their house. Megan still in her bathrobe, both of them wearing expressions of manufactured concern that I now recognized as performance art. "I am," I replied, setting down my suitcase and turning to face the officers directly. "But I'm not vulnerable, and I'm certainly not in distress. I'm leaving voluntarily." The younger officer consulted his notepad. Your family expressed concern that you might be confused about your circumstances, ma'am. They mentioned recent memory issues and some concerning behavior. I felt a flash of the old shame, the instinct to apologize and explain and make myself smaller to avoid causing trouble. But that woman was gone, left behind in the bank vault where I'd locked away 5 years of systematic diminishment. "Officer," I said, my voice clear and steady, "I'm 73 years old, not 7. I have every legal right to leave this house, and I'm doing so because I've discovered that my son and daughter-in-law have been stealing my money for 5 years while convincing me I was mentally incompetent." The change in both officers' expressions was immediate. The older one, whose nameplate read Martinez, looked from me to the family still hovering in the doorway, his professional assessment clearly shifting. "Ma'am, these are serious allegations," Officer Martinez said. "Do you have documentation to support what you're saying?" I reached into my purse and pulled out the folder of bank statements Janet had given me the day before. Yesterday I discovered that nearly $200,000 has been transferred from accounts I thought were under my control to accounts I never authorized. I have the statements right here. Officer Martinez reviewed the documents with the careful attention of someone who'd seen financial elder abuse cases before. After several minutes, he looked up at me with something that looked like respect. "Mrs. Walsh, these documents appear to show significant financial irregularities. Have you reported this to the appropriate authorities?" "I'm working with an attorney who specializes in elder abuse cases," I replied. "But right now, I just want to leave and visit my friend in Springfield. I'm not asking for anyone's permission." The younger officer approached Ethan and Megan, who had been whispering urgently to each other during my conversation with his partner. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see Ethan gesturing emphatically, his face flushed with the kind of righteous indignation that comes from being caught in wrongdoing and trying to reframe it as misunderstanding. After 20 minutes of separate conversations, Officer Martinez returned to me. "Mrs. Walsh, we're satisfied that you're acting of your own free will and that you're mentally competent to make this decision. Your family can't prevent you from leaving, and they can't force you to stay against your wishes. Do you need any assistance?" I looked at the taxi driver, who had been waiting patiently through this entire scene, probably wondering if he was going to be paid for his time. I looked at the house where I'd spent 5 years slowly disappearing. I looked at my son and daughter-in-law, who were staring at me with expressions of disbelief and fury. "No," I said, picking up my suitcase. "I think I can manage from here." But as I reached for the taxi door, Emma appeared at my elbow. My 15-year-old granddaughter, still in her pajamas, had slipped out of the house while the adults were focused on their confrontation. "Grandma Eleanor," she said, her voice small and uncertain. "Are you really leaving?" I looked down at her face, so young and confused, and felt my heart crack open. This child had been caught in the middle of adult machinations she couldn't understand, raised in a household where love was conditional and truth was whatever served the moment's purposes. "Yes, sweetheart, I am," I said gently, "but not because I don't love you. I'm leaving because I need to remember who I am when I'm not trying to be who other people want me to be." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "But what if something happens to you?" It was the first time in years that anyone in this family had expressed genuine concern for my well-being, rather than using my safety as an excuse to control my choices. "Then something happens to me," I said, cupping her face in my hands. "But it will happen to me, not to a shadow of me that's been diminished and dismissed until she's barely recognizable. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, though I suspected she didn't fully grasp what I was trying to tell her. Someday, when she was older, when she faced her own choices between safety and authenticity, maybe she would remember this moment and understand that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is allow other people to define who you are. "I love you," I told her, and meant it completely. "But I can't love you from inside a cage, even a golden one." The train ride to Springfield took 3 hours, but it felt like a journey through time as well as space. Each mile that passed between me and Chicago seemed to restore something that had been stripped away. My confidence, my sense of self, my belief that I had valuable contributions to make to the world. Margaret was waiting for me at the station, and when I saw her face, I understood what I'd been missing for 5 years. She looked at me and saw Eleanor Walsh, former head librarian, respected community member, intelligent woman with decades of experience and wisdom to offer. She didn't see a burden or a problem or a resource to be managed. She saw me. "You look terrible," she said, wrapping me in a hug that felt like coming home. "And absolutely beautiful." Margaret's house was everything my son's house wasn't. Warm, welcoming, filled with books and plants and the accumulated treasures of a life lived with intention rather than obligation. The guest room she showed me wasn't a closet with a window, but a genuine sanctuary, decorated with soft colors and comfortable furniture, with shelves for my books and space for my possessions. "This is yours for as long as you want it," Margaret said, setting my suitcase on the bed. "Forever, if you like. I've been rattling around in this house alone for 10 years, and I'd be grateful for the company." That evening, we sat in her living room drinking tea and catching up on 5 years of carefully curated communications. I told her everything: the systematic isolation, the financial abuse, the manufactured medical concerns, the planned guardianship that would have stripped away my legal rights completely. "I should have rescued you years ago," Margaret said when I finished. "I knew something was wrong, but I let them convince me you were fragile, that interference would upset you." "I convinced myself I was fragile too," I admitted. "It's amazing how quickly you can lose yourself when everyone around you treats you like you're already gone." Margaret leaned forward in her chair, her expression serious. "Eleanor, what they did to you was criminal. Financial elder abuse, psychological manipulation, fraud. These aren't family dynamics. They're crimes with real legal consequences." Sarah Mitchell, my attorney, said the same thing. "But pursuing charges would mean what?" Margaret challenged. "Would mean holding them accountable for what they did? Would mean preventing them from doing it to someone else? Would mean standing up for yourself and every other elderly person who's been dismissed and diminished by people who should love them?" She was right, of course. This wasn't just about my money or my dignity. It was about the principle that elderly people have the right to be treated with respect, to maintain control over their own lives, to be valued for their wisdom and experience rather than viewed as obstacles to younger people's ambitions. The phone started ringing that evening and didn't stop for 3 days. Ethan, Megan, even Emma and Michael calling to apologize, to explain, to beg me to come back and work things out. The conversations followed a predictable pattern. Initial anger giving way to bargaining, promises to change, threats about what would happen to me if I remained estranged from family. "You can't just abandon your responsibilities," Ethan said during one particularly heated call. "What about the kids? What about everything we've built together?" "What we built together?" I repeated. "You mean what I paid for while you planned to steal the rest?" "It wasn't stealing," he protested. "We were managing your assets, protecting you from making mistakes, ensuring your future security. By spending my money without my knowledge or consent? By moving it into accounts I couldn't access? By planning to have me declared incompetent so you could control it permanently?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. "Mom," he said finally, his voice smaller than I'd heard it since he was a child. "I never meant for it to go this far." But it did go this far," I replied. "And now you have to live with the consequences." On my 4th day in Springfield, Sarah Mitchell called with news that changed everything. "Eleanor, I've been reviewing the documentation you provided, and I've found evidence of systematic financial fraud going back to the month you moved in with them," she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd uncovered a particularly egregious crime. "Wire fraud, identity theft, forgery. We're talking about federal charges." "Federal charges?" I repeated, the magnitude of the situation finally hitting me. "They used electronic banking systems to transfer money across state lines using forged authorizations. That brings this under federal jurisdiction, which means serious prison time if they're convicted." I sat in Margaret's kitchen, looking out at her garden where late autumn flowers still bloomed despite the approaching winter, and tried to process the idea that my son might go to federal prison because of choices he'd made about my money. "What do I need to do?" I asked. "The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit wants to interview you next week. They'll need you to walk them through the timeline, provide testimony about what you knew and when you knew it, explain how the fraud was perpetrated. After I hung up, I sat at Margaret's kitchen table and cried for the first time since leaving Chicago. Not tears of sadness or regret, but tears of relief. Someone was finally taking seriously what had been done to me. Someone with legal authority was treating my experience as a crime rather than a family misunderstanding. Margaret found me there an hour later, still crying, still staring out at her garden. "Second thoughts?" she asked gently. "No," I said, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. "First thoughts. For the first time in 5 years, I'm thinking clearly about what I want instead of what other people want from me." "And what do you want?" I looked around Margaret's warm kitchen, at the woman who'd been my friend for 40 years, at the life that was waiting for me to claim it. "I want justice," I said. "I want my money back. I want to make sure they can't do this to anyone else. And I want to remember what it feels like to be valued instead of tolerated." Margaret smiled and put her hand over mine. "Then that's what we'll do." That night, I called Ethan one last time. "I want you to know that I forgive you," I said when he answered, my voice calm and clear. "I forgive you, and I love you, and I hope someday you'll understand that what I'm doing isn't about revenge. It's about dignity." "Mom, please," he said, and I could hear tears in his voice. "Don't do this to our family." "I'm not doing anything to our family," I replied. "I'm finally doing something for myself." And then I hung up the phone and began the rest of my life. 6 months after leaving Chicago, I bought my first piece of furniture in 5 years, a beautiful oak writing desk that I found at an estate sale in downtown Springfield. It wasn't the purchase itself that mattered, but what it represented. The radical act of choosing something for myself, with my own money, because it brought me joy. Margaret helped me carry it up to what had become my permanent room in her house, both of us laughing like teenagers as we maneuvered it through doorways and around corners. When we finally got it positioned by the window overlooking her garden, I ran my fingers across its smooth surface and felt tears of pure happiness. "It's perfect," Margaret said, understanding without explanation why this simple piece of furniture meant so much to me. "It's mine," I replied, and the word carried weight I hadn't felt in years. Mine. Not shared, not managed by someone else, not subject to another person's approval or oversight. Mine. I'd spent the winter months testifying for the FBI investigation, walking federal agents through 5 years of systematic financial abuse with the kind of detail that librarians excel at providing. Each interview had been both painful and cathartic. Painful to relive the manipulation and theft, cathartic to have it acknowledged as criminal behavior rather than family dynamics. The agents treated me with professional respect that bordered on admiration. "Mrs. Walsh, your documentation is extraordinary," Agent Jennifer Torres had said during one session. "Most victims of financial elder abuse don't have nearly this level of detailed evidence. Your record-keeping is going to make this case." My record-keeping. The obsessive notes I'd taken, thinking I was losing my mind, had actually preserved evidence of crimes that might otherwise have been impossible to prove. The journal I'd hidden in my dresser drawer, the bank statements I'd secretly copied, the calendar where I'd marked every suspicious transaction, all of it became exhibits in a federal criminal case. By March, the indictments were handed down. Ethan and Megan were charged with wire fraud, money laundering, and elder abuse under federal law. The local news covered the story with headlines that made me cringe. "Suburban couple accused of stealing elderly mother's life savings," and "Financial elder abuse case exposes dark side of family care." But mixed with my embarrassment was vindication. Other families came forward with similar stories after seeing the coverage. The FBI opened additional investigations. Sarah Mitchell, my attorney, started receiving calls from elderly people who recognized their own experiences in my testimony. "You've opened a door," Sarah told me after the indictments were announced. People who thought they were alone, who thought what was happening to them was normal family conflict, are realizing they have rights and legal recourse. The financial restitution came in April. Nearly $180,000 recovered from various accounts and investments where my money had been hidden. But more important than the money was what happened when I walked into First National Bank in Springfield to open my new accounts. "Mrs. Walsh," the bank manager said, reviewing my financial profile. With assets like these, you qualify for our premium wealth management services. Would you be interested in discussing investment strategies? Investment strategies. I was being offered financial services based on my own net worth, treated as a sophisticated client rather than a confused elderly person who needed others to make decisions for her. The banker spoke to me directly, explained options clearly, respected my questions, and listened to my preferences. I chose conservative investments, mostly bonds and CDs that would provide steady income without the volatility that might require constant management. But the key was that I chose. Every decision was mine, made with professional advice but not professional control. Spring in Springfield was a revelation. Margaret and I planted a vegetable garden together, choosing varieties based on what we wanted to eat, rather than what someone else thought was appropriate for women our age. We grew tomatoes and peppers and herbs, spending hours with our hands in the soil, talking about books and politics and dreams we'd thought were behind us. I want to travel, I told Margaret one afternoon as we transplanted seedlings. I want to see places I've only read about in books. So let's travel, she replied, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. I'm 73 years old. So? I'm 75, and I've been wanting to see the Northern Lights since I was 12. Want to go to Alaska with me this fall? Alaska. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. For 5 years, I'd been told that leaving the house without supervision was dangerous, that travel would be confusing and overwhelming, that my age made adventure inappropriate. What if something happens to us? I asked, echoing the voice of caution that had been installed in my head by people who used my safety as an excuse to control my choices. Then something happens to us in Alaska instead of in Springfield, Margaret said pragmatically. At least we'll have stories to tell. We booked the trip that evening, spending hours on Margaret's computer researching tours and hotels and flights. I'd forgotten the excitement of planning adventures, the anticipation of seeing new places and meeting new people. For years, my future had been something that happened to me rather than something I actively created. But the most significant change wasn't in my circumstances. It was in my relationship with myself. I started looking in mirrors again, really looking, seeing the woman who'd survived systematic abuse and fought her way back to dignity. My reflection still showed age and weariness, but it also showed strength and clarity that hadn't been there in years. I bought new clothes. Not because my old ones were worn out, but because I wanted to. Bright colors instead of the muted tones I'd chosen to make myself invisible. Comfortable but stylish shoes instead of the purely practical footwear I'd resigned myself to. A soft blue sweater that matched my eyes and made me feel beautiful for the first time in decades. Margaret and I attended cultural events around Springfield. Concerts and theater productions and art exhibitions that fed parts of my soul that had been starving. We joined a book club at the local library, where my decades of experience were welcomed rather than tolerated. I found myself expressing opinions again, disagreeing with interpretations, engaging in passionate discussions about literature and life. "You're blooming," Margaret said one evening after we'd returned from a particularly lively book club meeting where I'd defended an unpopular interpretation of a novel we'd all read. "It's like watching a flower that's been kept in darkness finally get proper sunlight." But the most unexpected gift of my new life came in late spring, when I received a letter that changed everything I thought I knew about my family's response to my actions. The envelope bore Emma's handwriting, my granddaughter's careful script that I recognized from years of helping with homework. Inside was a letter that made me cry tears of joy for the first time in months. "Dear Grandma Eleanor," it began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from any of us right now. But I had to write to tell you something important. You were right to leave. You were right to stand up for yourself. You were right about everything. Mom and Dad tried to convince Michael and me that you were sick, that you were confused and making bad decisions. But I've been watching them since you left, and I can see how they talk about people when they think those people can't fight back. They talk about you the same way they talk about Mom's sister who has depression and Dad's brother who lost his job. Like you're all problems to be managed instead of people to be loved. I'm 16 now, and I'm starting to understand things I didn't understand before. I remember how you used to light up when you talked about your old job at the library, or your house with the roses, or your friend Margaret. But then you got quieter and smaller, and I thought that was just what happened when people got older. I didn't realize that Mom and Dad were making you disappear. I want you to know that what you did was brave. I want you to know that I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself even when it meant losing us. I want you to know that you didn't lose me. I'm just waiting until I'm old enough to make my own choices about who I want in my life. I love you, and I miss you, and I hope someday I'll be as brave as you are. Your granddaughter, Emma P.S. I still have the copy of Jane Eyre you gave me for my birthday. I'm reading it again, and now I understand why you chose it for me. I read that letter 5 times before I could see clearly enough to dial Margaret's number and ask her to come upstairs. When she found me sitting on my bed, clutching the letter and sobbing, she read it herself, and then held me while I cried out months of accumulated grief and joy. She sees you, Margaret said when my tears finally subsided. Despite everything they tried to teach her about you, she sees exactly who you are. I wrote back to Emma that evening, sitting at my beautiful oak desk by the window, watching the sunset paint Margaret's garden in shades of gold and orange. I told her about my new life, about the garden and the book club and the Alaska trip Margaret and I were planning. I told her about the FBI investigation and the money recovered and the satisfaction of seeing justice served. But mostly, I told her about the woman I was becoming. Not the diminished, apologetic version of myself that I'd been in her parents' house, but the full, authentic Eleanor Walsh, who had opinions and dreams, and the courage to pursue them. I hope you'll remember, I wrote, that you don't have to make yourself smaller to earn love. Real love doesn't require you to disappear. Real love celebrates who you are and encourages you to become even more yourself. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call that surprised me more than Emma's letter. Michael, now 13 and apparently inheriting his sister's courage, had convinced his parents to let him call me Grandma Eleanor. His voice was deeper than I remembered, cracking with adolescence and emotion. I wanted to tell you I'm sorry. I'm sorry we weren't nicer to you. I'm sorry Mom and Dad took your money. I'm sorry I didn't stick up for you. Oh, sweetheart, I said, my heart breaking for this boy who was carrying guilt that wasn't his to bear. You were a child. It wasn't your job to protect me. But I could have been nicer, he insisted. I could have talked to you more, or asked about your stories, or helped you with stuff instead of always being on my phone. I closed my eyes and remembered the boy who used to show me his video games, who'd been warm but distant, who'd learned to treat me like furniture because that's how his parents treated me. Michael, listen to me carefully, I said. What happened in that house wasn't your fault, but you get to choose what happens next. You get to choose whether you treat people with respect or dismiss them. You get to choose whether you value people for who they are or what they can do for you. Those choices will determine the kind of man you become. We talked for an hour, the longest conversation I'd had with my grandson in years. He told me about school and friends and the books he was reading. I told him about Margaret's house and the garden and the Northern Lights trip we were planning. When we hung up, I realized something profound had happened. For the first time in 5 years, I'd had a conversation with a family member who was genuinely interested in my thoughts and experiences, who valued my presence rather than tolerating it. The woman who'd left Chicago in a taxi with a single suitcase, fleeing a family that had reduced her to a resource to be managed, was gone. In her place was Eleanor Walsh, traveler, gardener, book club member, federal witness, grandmother who commanded respect rather than begging for acceptance. I was 73 years old, and I was just getting started. 1 year later, I stood at the edge of a glacier in Alaska, watching the northern lights dance across the sky in ribbons of green and gold, and realized I had never felt more alive. Margaret stood beside me, both of us bundled in parkas we'd bought specially for this trip, our breath forming clouds in the Arctic air. At 74 and 76, we were probably the oldest people in our tour group, but we were also the most excited, the most present, the most willing to stand in the cold for hours just to witness something beautiful. Was it worth it? Margaret asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. She wasn't talking about the trip, and we both knew it. She was asking about everything. The painful confrontations, the legal battles, the loss of family relationships, The complete upheaval of a life I'd spent 5 years believing was settled and secure. I watched the lights pulse and shift above us, nature's own celebration of beauty and power, and thought about the woman who'd been standing in a Chicago kitchen 18 months ago, listening to whispered conversations about her incompetence while washing dishes for people who saw her as a burden. "Yes," I said, and the word came out strong and certain. It was worth all of it. The legal proceedings had concluded 6 months earlier, with plea agreements that sent both Ethan and Megan to federal prison. 18 months for him, 12 for her. The sentences were lighter than they could have been, but Sarah Mitchell had explained that cooperation with authorities and full restitution often resulted in reduced penalties. "They're young enough to rebuild their lives," she'd told me after the sentencing hearing. "The question is whether they'll learn from this experience or just become more careful about hiding their crimes." I'd attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the front row of the federal courthouse while my son and daughter-in-law stood before a judge who spoke about the special trust that adult children hold when caring for elderly parents, and how violating that trust struck at the foundation of family relationships and social safety nets. Ethan had turned to look at me before the bailiff led him away, his eyes filled with something that might have been regret or might have been resentment. I'd met his gaze steadily, neither gloating nor apologizing, just witnessing the natural consequence of choices he'd made about my life and my money. I felt sad for him, but I didn't feel guilty. There's a difference between love and enablement, between forgiveness and allowing yourself to be continually harmed. I could love my son while refusing to subsidize his criminal behavior. I could forgive his actions while maintaining boundaries that protected my own well-being. The children, Emma now 17 and Michael 14, had been placed with Megan's sister while their parents served their sentences. I'd offered to help financially with their care, an offer that had been accepted with suspicious gratitude. But I'd insisted on direct payments for specific expenses rather than general support that could be diverted to other purposes. Once burned, twice careful. Emma visited me in Springfield during her spring break, a week that transformed both of us. She was older now, more mature, with the kind of hard-won wisdom that comes from watching your parents face the consequences of their choices. But she was also lighter, as if a weight she'd been carrying had been lifted. "I used to think something was wrong with me," she told me one evening as we sat in Margaret's living room, sharing tea and homemade cookies. "Like, why didn't I feel the way I was supposed to feel about family stuff? Why did I always feel like I was walking on eggshells trying not to upset anyone?" "Because you were," I said simply. "You were living in a house where love was conditional, where people's worth was measured by their usefulness, where emotional manipulation was disguised as care." Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's weird being at Aunt Sarah's house. She asks me how I'm feeling about things, and when I tell her, she doesn't try to convince me I'm wrong. She just listens. That's what healthy relationships look like," I told her. "People who care about you want to understand your experience, not control it." We spent that week rebuilding our relationship on new foundations: mutual respect rather than obligatory family roles, genuine interest rather than performative affection. Emma helped me plan my next adventure, a trip to Ireland that Margaret and I were considering for the fall. She researched castles and countryside bed and breakfasts with the enthusiasm of someone who'd learned that dreams were meant to be pursued rather than deferred. "I want to travel when I graduate," Emma told me. "Maybe take a gap year before college and see some of the world." "That sounds wonderful," I said, and meant it. "What do your parents think about that idea?" Emma's expression darkened slightly. "They used to say travel was expensive and impractical, that I should focus on practical things that would help me get a good job. But now," she shrugged, "now I think maybe they were more interested in keeping me close so I could take care of them when they got older." The insight was painful but probably accurate. Parents who view their children as resources rather than individuals often discourage independence and adventure, preferring to cultivate obligation and proximity. Emma was breaking free from patterns that might have trapped her in the same cycle of manipulation and guilt that had nearly destroyed me. "You know what I've learned?" Emma said, as we planned her gap year possibilities. "Getting older doesn't mean your life gets smaller. It can mean your life gets bigger, if you let it." She was 17 years old, and already wiser than I'd been at 73. The book I'd started writing about my experience was nearly finished. A memoir that Sarah Mitchell thought could help other families recognize and address financial elder abuse. The writing process had been therapeutic, forcing me to examine not just what had been done to me, but how I'd participated in my own diminishment by accepting others' definitions of my worth and capabilities. The most dangerous lies, I wrote in one chapter, are the ones that contain just enough truth to seem reasonable. Yes, I was older and sometimes forgetful. Yes, managing finances could be complicated. Yes, I wanted to be helpful to my family. But none of those facts justified the systematic theft of my money or the deliberate erosion of my autonomy. Margaret had read every chapter as I completed it, offering feedback and encouragement. "You're not just telling your story," she said after reviewing the final chapter. "You're giving other people permission to tell theirs." The publication process was moving forward with a small press that specialized in social justice narratives. My story would be one voice among many, but voices create choruses, and choruses create movements, and movements create change. Standing under the northern lights, reflecting on everything that had brought me to this moment, I realized that my Alaska trip was more than just an adventure. It was a celebration of survival, of renewal, of the radical act of choosing yourself when everyone around you insists you should choose them instead. Margaret and I returned to Springfield energized and already planning our next adventure, Ireland in the fall, as Emma had helped us research. Then maybe Scotland, or a river cruise through Germany, or that art tour of Italy we'd been discussing. The world felt vast and welcoming, full of possibilities I'd never allowed myself to imagine. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon in September, exactly 2 years after I'd walked out of my son's house with a single suitcase, I received a phone call that surprised me more than anything that had happened since. "Mrs. Walsh? This is Jennifer Torres from the FBI. I wanted to let you know that your case has been selected as a model for a new elder abuse prevention program we're launching nationally. The program would use my story, with my permission, to train bank employees, social workers, healthcare providers, and law enforcement officers to recognize signs of financial elder abuse and intervene more effectively. My careful documentation, my detailed testimony, my willingness to pursue criminal charges despite family pressure, all of it would become educational material to help protect other elderly people from similar crimes. We'd like you to consider participating in some training sessions," Agent Torres continued, "sharing your experience directly with professionals who work with elderly clients. Your perspective could save other families from going through what you went through." I accepted immediately. The woman who'd been afraid to leave the house without permission 2 years earlier was now being asked to travel around the country, sharing her story with audiences of professionals, helping to change systems that had failed to protect her and countless others. That evening, I called Emma to share the news. "Grandma Eleanor, that's incredible," she said, her voice bright with pride and excitement. "You're going to be famous." "I'm going to be useful," I corrected. "There's a difference." "There is," Emma agreed, "and you've always been both. Some people just forgot to notice." As autumn arrived in Springfield, painting Margaret's garden in shades of gold and crimson, I reflected on the strange mathematics of loss and gain that had defined the past 2 years. I'd lost a son and daughter-in-law to prison, lost the illusion of a loving family, lost the security of believing that good behavior would be rewarded with continued acceptance. But I'd gained so much more. I'd gained my granddaughter's respect and my grandson's affection, earned through authenticity rather than obligation. I'd gained financial security, not just the money that had been returned to me, but the knowledge that I could manage it competently. I'd gained a voice, both literally through my speaking engagements and figuratively through my book and advocacy work. Most importantly, I'd gained myself back. The woman I'd been before I'd allowed others to convince me I was too old, too confused, too much of a burden to deserve respect and autonomy. On my 75th birthday, Margaret threw me a party that filled her house with friends I'd made through the book club, the garden society, the volunteer work I'd started doing at the local literacy center. People who knew me as Eleanor Walsh, interesting, engaged, contributing member of the community, rather than someone's elderly mother who needed to be managed and contained. Emma drove down from Chicago for the celebration, bringing Michael with her. We sat around Margaret's dinner table, sharing stories and laughter, and I realized this was what family was supposed to feel like. People choosing to be together because they enjoyed each other's company, not because obligation or guilt or financial dependency held them in proximity. "Make a wish, Grandma Eleanor," Michael said as I prepared to blow out the candles on Margaret's homemade chocolate cake. I looked around the table at faces that reflected genuine affection and respect, then closed my eyes and made my wish. Not for the past to be different, not for relationships that couldn't be repaired, not for time that couldn't be recovered. I wished for the future, for continued adventures with Margaret, for deeper relationships with Emma and Michael, for the strength to keep telling my story to audiences who needed to hear it, for the wisdom to keep choosing authenticity over acceptance, courage over comfort, truth over peace. I opened my eyes and blew out the candles, 75 flames extinguished in one breath, like the old life I'd left behind in Chicago. In the darkness that followed, before Margaret turned on the lights, I heard Emma's voice. "I'm proud of you, Grandma, for everything you did, for everything you became." And I realized that was worth more than all the money they'd stolen, all the years they'd wasted, all the dreams they'd tried to convince me were inappropriate for someone my age. I was 75 years old, and I was proud of me too. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever watched someone you love disappear little by little, dismissed and diminished until they barely recognized themselves? Have you ever wondered if it's too late to reclaim a life that others have tried to control? Tell me in the comments. Your story matters, your voice deserves to be heard, and your courage to speak your truth might be exactly what someone else needs to find their own strength. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and subscribe to this channel. Sometimes the most important message someone can receive is that they're not alone, that their experience matters, and that it's never too late to choose yourself. Because somewhere out there, another Eleanor is listening to whispered conversations about her competence, and she needs to know that the only opinion that truly matters is her own.